Conversations for Health, dedicated to engaging discussions with industry experts, exploring evidence-based cutting-edge research and practical tips. Our mission is to empower you with knowledge, debunk myths, and provide you with clinical insights. This podcast is provided as an educational resource for healthcare practitioners only. This podcast represents the views and opinions of the host and their guests and does not represent the views or opinions of Designs for Health, Inc. This podcast does not constitute medical advice. The statements contained in this podcast have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. Any products mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Now, let's embark on a journey towards optimal well-being, one conversation at a time. Here's your host, Evelyn Lambrecht.
Welcome to Conversations for Health. I'm your host, Evelyn Lambrecht, and I'm here with Dr. Andy Franklyn-Miller, world-leading specialist in sport and exercise medicine and chief medical officer at Nuritas. Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Evelyn, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you.
Me too. In this episode, we'll dive into the science behind PeptiStrong, a groundbreaking peptide developed by Nuritas, and talk about its clinical applications and research. And this conversation builds on an earlier discussion that I had with Dr. Nora Caldi, who's the CEO of Nuritas. If you have patients who are concerned with muscle retention as they get older, patients who aren't recovering as quickly as they'd like after exercise, maybe you have patients on GLP-1 medications and want to make sure they maintain lean muscle mass, we'll take a deeper look into the data, studies, and what it means for healthcare practitioners like you. To give our audience a little more context about your incredible background, Dr. Andy Franklyn-Miller is a highly accomplished physician with expertise in physiology, clinical design, and science communication. He has a Ph.D. in biomechanics and served in the Royal Navy and Royal Marines for 16 years. He has extensive experience working with high-profile sports teams and elite performance and has published over 60 peer-reviewed papers. He's also an editor at the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And at Nuritas, he oversees multiple departments, including software engineering, data curation, data science, proteomics, lab, and regulatory departments. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today, Andy. Before we fully dive in, what's lighting you up this week?
You know, what's really exciting is we have just had two clinical trial results on two new ingredients reporting. We've just got the data, and indeed 580 pages is a summary of one set of data, so you can kind of imagine where we are, but it's tremendously exciting. We've got potential here in glucose control, in cortisol management, so two new ingredients coming that way, and so I'm deep in data analysis. Desperately exciting.
That sounds amazing and really fun. And you have quite an impressive background, and you came from this world, and I can clearly hear the excitement in your voice. So what drew you to Nuritas?
Do you know, as a physician, we're limited in the ability to see a number of patients. So I might have seen 25 patients a day, looked after elite teams, and your impact on the world is always limited by time. One of the amazing things about peptides is they have the potential to extend access to everybody over their potential health benefits. So the excitement here is in building out an ingredient portfolio that can change the lives of billions and improve access. And that's what attracted me. It was the ability to increase health by design in millions and billions of people. And Nuritas has already had millions of doses of PeptiStrong around the world in different formats. And that's what drives me.
That's awesome. So let's take it a few steps back. What exactly are peptides?
Absolutely. Look, peptides are everywhere. There's indeed a peptide solution for pretty much every problem we could come up with. They're small signaling molecules. They happen to be a chain of amino acids, so small proteins. Not tiny, so not at the sort of molecular stage, but they have a function. And what they do is bind to a specific receptor and trigger a specific chain of events. And we might know them from pharmaceutical peptides. And there are about 40 pharmaceutical peptides that have been developed. The most famous probably now, moving on from insulin, is almost certainly the GLP-1 agonists, semaglutide, etc. But they're, remember, heavily modified. They've been identified and then modified to extend function, such as half-life or bioavailability. And then others may know of peptides in the compounding pharmacy space, where a lot of off-license or out-of-patent peptides, such as BPC or ipamorelin, exist, and they're very much injectables. So peptides have a signaling function. They up or down regulate a pathway, and we're using them to impact health.
Very interesting, and thank you for explaining that distinction. So, what are the benefits of peptides related to athletic performance? And then let's get into PeptiStrong a little bit. What is PeptiStrong and what makes it unique?
Absolutely right. So Nuritas is focused on identifying natural peptides. So that means they're unmodified. And our source library is over 9 million peptides that we've identified from natural plant food grade sources. And one of the challenges people would ask is, but are they bioavailable? How do they get into the body? And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's part of our AI development in order to be able to predict those that will survive digestion and absorption. And we model for that, and we can talk a little bit about it later. So what we've been able to do with PeptiStrong is shortcut millions of years of development, because within PeptiStrong, there are 5 clusters of peptides. So it's not just one. It's not concentrated. And those 5 clusters work in very specific areas. One, increased protein synthesis. So that's where we assist in terms of building muscle and accelerating the mTOR pathway. The second area is on reducing muscle breakdown. People will often know about it as sarcopenia in a medical term, or age-related muscle loss for the patient. And we look at 2 pathways there, MRF1 and atrogen1, in terms of preventing that activation, that gene expression, in terms of that breakdown. We've then 3 other areas: peptides that work on anti-inflammation, peptides that work on ATP production, and peptides that work on bone mineralization. And so what you get with PeptiStrong is 5 different mechanisms of action, 5 different benefits in a 2.4 gram dose, which gives both a compact but very broad functionality.
We'll dive into some of the mechanisms of action further, because I do have questions about the pathways, and I do think that practitioners want to know, but I think they also want to know, what are some of the things that you actually see in clinical practice, and what is some of that clinical evidence? So I would like, actually, before I ask about that, I have a few questions to set the stage a little bit more. So PeptiStrong is derived from the fava bean, right? One question that I've received several times from practitioners is there an issue for those with G6PD deficiency?
It's a great question. And certainly one, when we extract the ingredient, it does come from fava bean. So those with a bean allergy ought to avoid this as a supplement. In terms of glucose-6-phosphodehydrogenase, which is farbidem, the amount of fava bean in the end ingredient is very, very small, and it's under the limit of triggering of farbidem. However, a patient who was considering taking it ought to have that discussion in terms of previous reactions they may or may not have. But it's below the threshold. But certainly we have it as a caution as the ingredient, because it comes from that source material in terms of fava.
Okay. And then another question that I've received is around the digestion part. So how do you make sure that the peptides actually perform their action and have their signaling effects and don't get digested? And how do they not just break down to amino acids?
Absolutely. Even it's a really good question. And so, for example, there are over 5,000 peptides in PeptiStrong, the ingredient. And we know that well over 90% of those are digested in the gut as normal and broken down into amino acids, like many peptides are. What we know from our own experimentation in the lab is, and it really goes back to how we identify an ingredient. What we do when we start is we use our AI prediction tool, Magnifier, to look for peptides in certain areas. And with PeptiStrong, we look for muscle health. So we looked at peptides that would work on pathways in multiple areas. If we picked one and then performed a set of experiments on that one peptide, we might have been right or we might have been wrong, but we could have spent 6 months proving that point. So what Magnify is able to do is take our 9 million peptides and condense them down to those that will filter for certain survival characteristics. And when we got down to the last 100 or so peptides that we wanted to examine, what we do with those is we synthesize the peptides and we test them. So we test the synthetic peptides first on a survival model, an InfoGest model, which is FDA approved, in terms of which of those peptides will survive digestion. And then we pre-select our raw material to contain the peptides that survive digestion. And then we retest the ingredient against those synthetic peptides. So we can be 100% sure that the peptides that are predicted to be in the ingredient and survive have gone through the InfoGest 2 model and have therefore proven jejunal absorption. So the idea is we know a lot get digested, and of course they do. But the signaling peptides, the reason fava-bean was the source material, is that gave us, after our hydrolysis production, access to the peptides that will survive.
Very interesting. Because I've also gotten the question, can't I just eat more fava beans? But then you're not accessing
It's a great
those.
question. And actually, thankfully, others have done exactly that experiment. They've taken the fava bean, or even a hydrolysis of it, and a non-precise hydrolysis, and then looked to see if those benefits of increases in strength, increases in recovery and energy are conferred, and they're not. So it's the specific way that we manage this ingredient in its production to unlock those peptides in the areas that they are, which gives the activity.
Very interesting. Okay, so can you walk us through the 3 human clinical studies and the results of each one, and maybe incorporate some of the mechanisms of action with each one that you saw?
Of course. The first study was really focused on maintenance of muscle mass. So the idea was, could this ingredient retain muscle? And so again, looking at that mechanism of action, mTOR, that upregulation of protein synthesis, and also the MRF1, estrogen-1 gene expression, the prevention of muscle breakdown. So in this first study, 30 subjects, all male, unfortunately, what we did was put them in plaster of Paris. So we immobilized the leg from hip to ankle for a week. That was to induce muscle damage. And what we saw was that we got increases in creatine kinase, we got decreases in cross-sectional area that again were consistent with inducing that muscle damage. We took the cast off, and then for 2 weeks, they self-mobilized. So there was no exercise component, so they weren't training. They were randomized, blinded, to either 20 grams of PeptiStrong or 20 grams of milk protein concentrate. And often people question that 20-gram dose, and you can see why. It was a blinded trial. It was diet controlled. This was milk versus PeptiStrong, and it was important to have the 2 conditions similarly. What we saw at muscle biopsy was 4 times increase in FSR, so that's the protein synthesis rate, in the PeptiStrong group compared to the milk protein group. So this was 4 times protein synthesis of muscle in these subjects. What we also saw was that 2 weeks after the self-mobilization part, a significant increase in muscle strength. So the subjects taking PeptiStrong regained over their baseline strength, whereas the subjects taking milk protein concentrate regained about 65% or so of their muscle strength. So this was amplifying muscle force, and it was increasing protein synthesis. We also saw in some of the myokines a decrease in creatine kinase and some of the other enzymes of breakdown, but predominantly what I take from this study is PeptiStrong amplifies the mTOR pathway and limits some of the breakdown of muscle and some of the damage in and associated with muscle.
Before we go further, I have some questions about the mTOR pathway. I think it's received a lot of attention, right? People talk about it in the context of rapamycin. So I know that mTOR is the central regulator of muscle protein synthesis, but can you just explain a little bit more what's important about it?
For sure. And look, there is some controversy around mTOR. You know, as you say, with rapamycin and some of the longevity space, there is a question about whether you can do too much upregulation of mTOR and whether it can cause some fibrosis or indeed mitotic or cancerous change in cells. What I'll go back to is muscle is the low-hanging fruit for longevity. There are systematic reviews demonstrating 27% shift in all-cause mortality. So that's including cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, all-cause cancers, neurodegenerative change. If you have everything else optimized in life in terms of that you have muscle strength and muscle mass, lean body mass, decreased inflammation, then there is potentially room for wriggle in terms of that mTOR regulation. And there is also a difference between mTOR1 and mTOR2. Some very recent studies on looking at the muscle loss associated with GLP-1 agonist treatment suggest that there's also muscle loss via the mTOR2 pathway. And the mTOR2 pathway is cardiac muscle, mTOR1 pathway, skeletal muscle. PeptiStrong was designed to only focus on mTOR1, so there are no effects on cardiac muscle. There's no amplification of mTOR2. But obviously, if cardiac muscle starts to deteriorate, there's a chance of left ventricular hypertrophy, cardiac failure, and all of the associated changes. So to go back to mTOR, think about this as pushing a flywheel or pulling a flywheel. At the top of the mTOR pathway, leucine and arginine, two amino acids, are there to bind and upregulate the pathway. So you need protein for mTOR to work. PeptiStrong works at the bottom, at the ribosomal S6 pathway. So it pulls through the pathway. So if you don't have protein at the top, you can't pull through. You can upregulate mTOR by just using more leucine and arginine to a point. Although some recent work suggests that as we age, 50 plus, mTOR becomes quite sticky and the leucine upregulation has stopped. So we can't just upregulate mTOR via that pathway by giving more leucine, which is a common misconception. And so there's some good cellular work, and we're producing some work in the lab looking at young and old myotube cells with the Salk Institute, looking at the very detailed breakdown of that to come via nature metabolism. So watch that space. But certainly from an aging perspective, in those aged cells, we don't see that problem with PeptiStrong. So PeptiStrong will continue to upregulate mTOR independent of leucine availability. A really strong reason for why that can support dietary change, can support longevity, can support that age-reduced muscle loss.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's talk about the second study.
Absolutely. The second study I ran before joining Nuritas. Here we had male subjects, again, slightly older, 30 to 45. These were trained subjects. The idea here was that we would induce muscle damage and compare whether PeptiStrong or placebo showed a difference. To induce muscle damage, we put them into a Cybex, an isokinetic dynamometer, and we ran them through a leg extension, isometric hold, and flexion regime to exhaustion. We then tested the strength through a multi-rep program on the Cybex at 72 hours after that insult of injury. What we saw here, PeptiStrong, 2.4 grams compared to placebo. We saw significant increases in strength recovery. So the PeptiStrong group, again, returned 72 hours with stronger than baseline measures in strength. One of the really interesting differences, though, was in a concept of muscular energy. We often get confused when we talk about muscular endurance, and then is that measuring VO2 max or is it measuring oxidative capacity? What does it really measure? So muscular energy is, technically speaking, the difference in torque. So if we think about extending our leg against a machine, every degree of change in that machine adds a layer of force. So we might find it easy to start with and hard to finish, or easy to finish and hard to start with. So an isokinetic dynamometer measures the torque through that whole angle. So the amount of force we apply throughout the range. If we imagine the first rep and the last rep, if you've got a lot of muscular energy, you can match that. You can match your performance at the start or finish. If you're getting out of a car to climb a flight of stairs or to play a round of golf or to go shopping or to go out and play a round of tennis or play with the grandkids, it's the same thing. It's your ability to do the same thing over and over again. Do you want to go and do another class in the gym? Do you want to go out and get the energy to go and do what you want to do? It's the same concept. What we saw with PeptiStrong was a significant impact in that muscular energy, almost 130% difference between the two groups in terms of muscular energy. And we also saw a range of myokines. So we saw suppression of myostatin, again, as an effect of that action MRF1 pathway of reducing muscle breakdown and then also a dampening of some of the inflammatory responses. So in the second study, increases in strength, increases in muscular energy.
So I have two follow-up questions for you. So in this study, you used the 2.4 gram dose. Why did you decide to use that one at that point versus what you had used in the previous one?
Absolutely. So when we design the experimentation in and around the peptides, we have an AI model which will generate our optimum dose. And remember, this ingredient has a number of applications in the mineral supplement space, in the space that your practitioners are using it, but also in food. And so this is not a pharmacological product. So this doesn't have the typical dose relationship, the dose curves as part of its production. So we use an AI-generated optimized dose, which is 2.4 grams. The previous study, it was very much a study designed to act as a placebo control. So it had to match the amount of milk protein. So 2.4 grams is the AI-generated optimum dose.
Okay. And then I also have a question about the MRF1 pathway. Can you explain that more in the context of everything that we're talking about, like muscle breakdown, muscle energy, power, et cetera?
Absolutely. So again, this concept of sarcopenia, why do we lose muscle in terms of age-related change? So MRF1 and Actogen1 are FOX mediated gene expression markers. And what they do is reduce the turnover of muscle. So we want to inhibit that pathway. We don't want muscle breakdown to occur in terms of muscle loss. There are obviously multiple factors there. So sufficient protein, sufficient muscle stimulus, and all of these things take part in that training. But one of the significant factors we've already talked about in terms of this dampening of the leucine drive of the mTOR pathway. So in combination, retaining muscle and maintaining that mTOR balance pathway really is an anti-sarcopenic measure. So it's preventing the expression of these genes.
Okay. And then I don't know if you mentioned it or I just have it in my notes, but the Actogen1 pathway, can you explain that one as well and how it ties in?
The same two. So they map their FOX-mediated gene expression.
Okay.
It's just the two different alleles are the same pathway.
Gotcha. Okay. And then what about the third trial that was done on PeptiStrong?
Absolutely. So the third trial, we've actually just responded today to the reviewers' comments from the British Medical Journal Nutrition submission. Here we looked at men and women. This was an exercise trial. So we had 2 months of exercise programming, 3 times a week in the gym. And we compared again placebo to PeptiStrong. With this trial, we took novices. So they hadn't been in the gym before. And so we expected them, both groups, to increase in strength. And our outcome measures primarily were strength and again, this muscular energy concept. We used diaries to measure their protein intake, and the protein intake between both groups was matched. There was no statistical difference between the two groups. What we saw was a 17% increase in strength in the PeptiStrong group compared to the placebo group. So the placebo group got stronger, but the PeptiStrong group was 17% stronger at the end of the study than the placebo group. And when we looked at muscular energy, the number of reps to fatigue or the number of reps completed, we had almost a doubling, again, a statistically significant doubling of number of reps in the PeptiStrong group to placebo. And what's not in the paper is because the study was designed as men and women combined, we didn't power the study to look for statistical differences between men only or women only. But what we did see, interestingly, is that the men gain strength quicker. So the men gain most of their strength in the first month. The women gain strength very evenly across the 2 months. And that's useful advice for practitioners using the product in terms of watching that curve. So men gain strength quicker than the women.
That's really interesting. Are you doing additional trials looking at just women or kind of teasing this out further?
Yeah, absolutely. So where we are now is that we have many research partners taking the ingredient and beginning to do additional research, both with PeptiStrong and other ingredients in combination. There's a current trial looking at an age population underway in Hungary. and there's a trial in the UK underway in terms of, again, teasing out the differences between men and women and their responses. So more to come, not yet on the radar.
Great. And then I also want to talk about two other mechanisms, the reducing inflammation and the effect on TNF-alpha, and then also on ATP production. Can you address both of those?
Well, let's talk about ATP. So one of the areas we've been looking at is how PeptiStrong compares to other ingredients. And we've been doing that obviously in cells because it's an awful lot easier to do. And again, this is pre-submission work, so I can talk a little bit about it, but I can't talk necessarily too much in depth. But what we saw with PeptiStrong was when we looked at it compared to creatine, PeptiStrong at 2.4 grams compared to the 5-gram doses we typically see with creatine matches ATP production in cells. Wow. Now, that's exciting because that's creatine's main focus. What we also saw was some synergy effect. So there was an amplification of creatine's effect when you put PeptiStrong on, but in a different way. So some of the ATP production obviously is divided between oxidative phosphorylation and glycolysis in terms of the two mechanisms. And we see an OXPHOS increase with PeptiStrong that we don't see with creatine. That's exciting because the two work via slightly different pathways. And so therefore, we can get an amplification effect, which we've also seen in those trials. So creatine and PeptiStrong go very well together as a combination, because when we look at the phospho-S6 response, the increase in protein synthesis, creatine doesn't really do that, and we wouldn't expect it to. But PeptiStrong beats it 5 times because that's one of the additional benefits. We have pathways and peptides working in different pathways. And then you touched on inflammation. And PeptiStrong was designed to work via TNF-alpha to suppress some of the longer-standing inflammation associated with muscle. Inflammation is a complex area, and we know now that low-grade inflammation generally in the body is responsible for an awful lot of our long-standing non-communicable disease type prevention. We know that inflammation can lead to metabolic syndrome. We can know that inflammation can lead to cardiovascular disease. So inflammation prevention is something Nuritas is very passionate about in terms of peptides very specifically. What we want in terms of an acute response to muscle injury, however, is we want a spike of inflammation. So we want IL-6 to increase, but then we want to suppress it because it takes away some of the muscle soreness and some of the anti-factors in muscle synthesis. And that's what we found. When we looked at the myokines in both the second and the third studies with PeptiStrong, we see there's a transient increase in inflammatory markers and suppression of the secondary response. So within one to 2 days after the insult of exercise, we see suppression, which is what we really want in terms of. And when we use patient-reported outcome measures, we did with the third trial, we see significant increases in perceived feeling of wellness, reduced soreness, feelings of energy. And that correlates well with those decreases in inflammation.
That's really interesting. Since you brought up the creatine, I want to go back to that because, well, I think that we know that creatine has additional benefits, right? But the synergistic effect with PeptiStrong is really cool. What about some other ingredients like MyHMB, or you touched on leucine earlier? Do you see a synergistic effect for those as well? Like, how does a practitioner prioritize what to recommend?
Absolutely right. And so with HMB, again, when we do a comparison, HMB works via mTOR and upregulating. Remember, HMB is a subsidiary of leucine, so it's a breakdown product potentially. So it works via the same pathway. We see that at half the dose, PeptiStrong is 60% better. So it works better than HMB at a smaller dose. But then also there is a synergistic effect. When you combine the two together, it's 130% of the effect. So again, HMB, PeptiStrong work well together or can allow you to reduce the dose of some of the other ingredients. And it's similar with leucine. What we see with leucine is PeptiStrong is 4 times superior than leucine at upregulating mTOR at 100th of the dose. So you have an intensity of effect with peptides that you don't get with substrate. And leucine obviously being, as I was saying, it's a push at the top of mTOR. The precision peptides allow you to get upregulation of activity with less amount. So you can narrow the portfolio, if you like, in terms of prescription, or you can use the synergistic benefits with whey, with HMB, with leucine, and with creatine to get an amplification of the effect.
So HMB does more than just protein synthesis, right?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And that's where the complementary nature here really comes in. PeptiStrong has these very 5 specific areas. HMB has its own, along with creatine. We know that creatine has some neurocognitive function that we've recently seen in paper publication, and even a cardiac prevention work published just today. But we also see with HMB, there are other benefits in terms of bone, in terms of energy, that certainly, again, align with that complementary prescription.
Great. So from a clinical perspective, how do you see these impacting patient outcomes? Obviously, you've done the clinical trials, right? But you're working with patients, you're hearing testimonials. Are there particular patient populations or conditions where PeptiStrong shows the most promise? Because I think most of the testimonials that I've received and that I've been sharing are in athletes, though there are, some other ones where it helped with fatigue. But I think that I've even, encouraged more of my practitioners who I know work out regularly to try it out. So I'm curious, like, aside from like sarcopenia, where can it be the most beneficial?
So I think there are, in certain, what I've seen so far and where I've used it, it's very much in the active aging as an energy muscle support structure. So certainly in the group that are still active, but perhaps not gym goers and struggling to maintain the same level of energy that they would have had previously, I think it works incredibly well in that sort of group. So that's that sort of 45 onwards through to 70s, who aren't necessarily in a care home or in aged care facilities or very immobile, but certainly those that are struggling to get up and go. And that's an area I think really that's very strong. In the athletic support, we're seeing increasing use by professional teams. And certainly in that area, in terms of enhanced recovery and in terms of enhanced performance, it's very resonating very well in that population, particularly in that group with rapid muscle growth and maintaining the ability to keep on that sort of almost overload pathway. And then that third group, certainly in terms of where we've seen some significant benefit, is where there is some expected muscle loss. So obviously with a significant number of prescriptions of GLP-1 agonists in terms of managed weight loss, PeptiStrong is filling the void in trying to maintain muscle mass in those areas. And certainly we see some interest in some longer term studies about to start in the UK, looking at those coexistent prescriptions in order to try to maintain that lean muscle mass, which is so critical in terms of general health.
I was going to ask you about those on GLP-1 medications because they are so common now. So that's really great. And Andy, you said something there about the 45-year-olds. I hope that they're not in the long-term care facilities yet. So you made me think of something else. I asked you earlier about doing trials more specifically in women. And I'm curious because I'm sure you've seen there's a big movement right now about women in perimenopause and postmenopause and the maintenance of muscle mass. Like people are really realizing how critical this is. Do you have any studies planned to differentiate some of the results between maybe women of reproductive age, perimenopausal, and postmenopausal?
We're actually collaborating on a study in the Netherlands, which is due to kick off just in Q2 of this year, which is looking at actually the individual prescription of food or meals and looking at the individual response. It's part of a much wider study, and our impact there is to look at PeptiStrong in terms of the preservation of muscle and preservation of energy in very specific subsets of the population, of which that is one. And I think you're absolutely right. There are very few studies focused in and around perimenopausal women, and the maintenance of muscle mass is so important that it's certainly an area we're looking at in terms of dedicated studies by Nuritas in the future, because both in terms of future ingredients where we're looking at some very specific products, but also just in terms of balancing the amount of research that's out there. And even the periodization of dosage of supplements is different in women, and certainly although we were delighted to see the benefits in men and women in our last clinical trial, certainly what I was describing in that sort of step-by-step approach suggests that actually the response may be a little slower in women in some categories. And certainly we need to investigate that further.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you shared that because that's really helpful to know. And I think in men too, right? Because a lot of times I think we do these studies in young college aged kids, like 18 to 22-year-olds. And maybe they're the ones who would volunteer to have their legs in a cast for 7 days.
Yeah.
But I think so much of the research in general is done on college age kids, right? Because, or, kids, they're adults at that point, but you know what I mean? So I'm curious about studying in older men as well.
And, I think, many of your practitioners will be well aware of the challenges of publication. And that's one of the challenges here is we'd love to do more real world studies. And actually, you'll see from Nuritas, all of our studies moving forward will have some form of wearable technology embedded within the study so that, you can use with your patients, well, look, in this study, we saw these sort of changes. Because I think the client, the patient is getting more and more informed about wanting to see actual hard evidence of the benefit of what they're being prescribed. Alongside that, the presenting of individual results rather than group means is really valuable. One of the challenges, though, is the major journals don't love that sort of publication. And yet we all deal with individuals every day. So actually what matters to us is how the individual in front of us changes, and we're giving personalized care to that individual. And so there is a pivot shift in research. You'll see from Nuritas much more real-world studies in terms of much broader age ranges and much less restrictive in terms of inclusion criteria. Because you're right, if you get too strict on inclusion criteria, it's not real world. If we look at a 50-year-old who's got no underlying disease states and no concurrent prescriptions, that's pretty rare. So, there is a Lancet publication suggesting only 1 in 15 patients is technically healthy with no concurrent illnesses. And so if we only focus on those people to do our research, we don't give a representative sample. So what you'll see from us is more and more broader range ranges, wider inclusion criteria, and individual result publications using wearables as the way to do that, as well, of course, as our primary outcome measures as normal.
That's really cool. I always think it's so hard with clinical research, especially for those of us in integrative, functional, naturopathic medicine, et cetera, is we're not just recommending one thing at a time, right? Like we're recommending diet changes. We're looking at genetics. We're looking at what's going on in the gut microbiome. And so you're not ever in the real world looking at one thing in isolation. And even within studies on nutrition, it's very hard unless you feed everybody the exact same thing to even control for that, right? I think that's one of the biggest issues with a nutritional epidemiology is the surveys that it's based on. Like I couldn't tell you everything that I ate yesterday, or I'd probably not report it completely accurately, right?
Absolutely. And then so you're left with a very non-real world study where you bring people into a laboratory for 4 weeks and feed them only what they're allowed. And that's what we're working on in the Netherlands, in that sort of almost lab-controlled environment. You get a great physiological answer, but it's not very practical. And you're absolutely right. Patients are patients, and they've got lives, and they do things, and they don't do the same things every day. My time as team doctor for Olympic rowing, it was very different. Our patients, our athletes, we had data on blood lactates and blood ureas 4 or 5 times a session for every session, for every day of every Olympic cycle. And some athletes were on their 4th Olympic cycle. So you could compare training session 260 with training session 260 for every year for 12. And so that's the benefit, but it's not real world.
That's fascinating. So for practitioners who are interested in implementing PeptiStrong, we've given some little tidbits, but what do they need to know? Like, are there specific clinical guidelines around timing, for example? Do you take it around workouts? Do you skip days? Can you talk more about that?
So in all of the studies, we've advised taking it in the morning, normally an hour before a meal. There was no real evidence for why that case is. Certainly, what we know in terms of peptides, if you take it with a meal, it's likely to be challenged by the gut acidity, and it may take a little longer in terms of being absorbed. But the effect of these peptides is relatively short. They're plant-based peptides. We know their half-lives. they'll upregulate the signal and they'll be gone. This is not a long-lasting effect. You don't need it. It's an upregulation of a signal. So the timing matters much less. Taking them on an empty stomach, obviously better in terms of absorption, and then it's a bit more controlled. And 2.4 grams in terms of the dose. In the elderly or the over 50s, we know that leucine dampening, and so there's little evidence to suggest that an unrestricted protein at that level will give any amplification, but the PeptiStrong will.
Okay, very good. And what about your personal experience taking it? What have you noticed?
So I think one of the most marked things, when I was designing the study, I'll hold my hand up, I was designing it to fail. I was a little bit skeptical. And what blew me away was this force amplification. So this increase in strength and energy. And I would say my take home from PeptiStrong is this feeling of energy, the ability to keep going, to do what you were doing beforehand, and push out more reps in the gym is probably the most obvious take home. But the feeling of energy is this base level, which I think really is transformational. As for bone density, our last study, we saw an increase of 0.7% difference in increase in bone mineralization. I've not done an annual DEXA yet, but I'll be interested to see what my bone density is like, because we've been particularly favorable compared to vitamin D and calcium supplementation. So again, an area where peptide activity is superior.
That's really cool. And one of my colleagues, he had an amazing change in bone, or an increase in bone mineral density. I think it was in 6 or 7 weeks, and also a decrease in fat mass. So
that's it. We had a similar effect to vitamin D and calcium over a year in 2 months of supplementation. So again, via a pretty specific pathway in osteocrine. So it's certainly a go-to in that area.
Yeah, I've heard some other amazing testimonials, and I shared one from our CEO when I interviewed Dr. Nora, which was incredible, probably one of the best I'd heard, because he was training for an ultra marathon at the time. And then a friend of mine, he saw me post about it. I didn't give it to him. He bought it himself. And then, I didn't hear from him for a little bit, but about a month later, he had been training for a marathon, and he said that he sent me a screenshot of his VO2 max, and it was 60. And I was like, what was it before? And he said it was in the high 40s, low 50s. So that's in 1 month, it really jumped up. And he said he felt like he was always running tired prior.
Yes.
And he said that after taking the PeptiStrong for a month, he felt like he could go for a run at any time of the day, which was really cool. And he also ran his fastest mile ever. Now, that was also partially training, but this is somebody who was a college athlete and now in his early 40s. So that was a really cool story that I got from someone.
No, absolutely. And we have a global elite team currently looking at power output with PeptiStrong and another one of our ingredients, which is not yet released, looking at a combination of glucose maintenance and power output. So there are some really exciting performance studies on the way that I can't yet share with you, but the early results look really exciting, and I think a lot of that is ATP in terms of this force amplification and that feeling of power. So I think it's transformational. If this was 5 different ingredients put together, it would either be too expensive or it would be synthetic. And I think the fact that this comes from nature, that we've got a significant amount of science here to identify very specific peptides that have been through all of our preclinical batteries, but also 3 successive clinical trials overlapping with results, is really exciting.
You mentioned some of the future clinical trials that you have planned. Are there any that you would really like to see happen in the next couple of years? Like if you could design your optimal trial?
Absolutely. I think, as you touched on it earlier, the menopausal women study is one that's really quite exciting and one I'd really like to pursue. And also the variation of PeptiStrong with a combination of our other ingredients, which is really exciting in terms of how different pathways can work together. And so the combination of the new results that we've got from new clinical trials, but particularly around the menopausal women, I think is an area which needs more work.
Yeah, your excitement is definitely contagious. And so I'm curious, clearly Nuritas is at the forefront of peptide discovery. So what do you see as the role of peptides in transforming healthcare in the future?
So I think peptides, very small ingredients, can ultimately make it into everyday food staples in a sort of micro dose. So that improves access to patients who can't afford supplementation or medication if the end use can be in staples. But there'll always be space here, because dose responses, individualized prescription is really the domain that we're talking in today. And Nuritas will work very, very hard in those areas to look at the interactions, dose variations, and in a very much a practitioner space in terms of unlocking access to data that's not available in that mass market in terms of FMCG. So our goal is to produce ingredients in every NCD vertical. We want to work in every area of health and provide solutions in those, and ultimately improve access to health for everybody rather than those who are just paying for it.
Yeah, that's really cool. Very exciting. We're going to wrap up here with some rapid fire questions that we ask every guest. So what are your 3 favorite supplements for yourself? Obviously, one is PeptiStrong.
Absolutely. PeptiStrong has to hit number 1. An undisclosed peptide that we've just produced is also my go-to, working on concentration and focus. And then creatine. I think everyone should be on creatine. There's no excuse.
Very cool. And what are your favorite health practices that keep you healthy, resilient, and balanced?
You know, one of my I'm a big believer in the Pomodoro technique. So 30-minute meetings with, a 5-minute gap in between to change focus. One of the things in starting Nuritas, I had to go back to my biochemistry and peptide days from medical school, having been in clinical practice for a number of years. And my first month, literally every 30 minutes, I changed topic, both in terms of the partnerships we had, the peptide chemistry, mass spectroscopy, and I love it. I love that ability, and I think that keeps things fresh. Second thing has to be gym for me. Lifting weights, it's that key to longevity and focus, and I think that's absolutely vital. And then I'm a theatre fan, and so I need to have theatre once a week somewhere in my life in order to make it happy.
Once a week? That's Absolutely amazing. Okay, plays or musicals?
Both. I'll take
okay.
More.
What's your favorite musical?
Great question. I was in New York and saw Sunset Boulevard with Nicole Scherzinger 3 weeks ago, and wow. It stands out. It was absolutely incredible.
Awesome. Love it. I love musicals. Okay, and final question for you. What is something you've changed your mind about through all of your years in this field?
I think the ability to understand what food as medicine is about. And so, it was this big category about avoiding processed food, about making choices which were selective and restrictive. And I think what I've changed my mind about is that mission is one that's very valuable, but it needs to be unlocked without being selective. We need to be able to give the consumer more choice via mitigation against those choices, rather than say or believe that the world is not going to eat processed meat. The world is not going to avoid unprocessed food. For economies of scale, for reality, and the world trying to force people down a push to those products is not going to work. We need more choice. We need to be able to mitigate against poor choices or treats. And I think that understanding of how to implement food as medicine, I think, has been my big shift.
It's a very interesting thought, and it kind of relates back to improving access for everyone, right?
Yeah. Yes. And I think lowering that barrier to access is fundamental to Nuritas' mission. Yeah,
very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Andy. This was a very insightful conversation. I really appreciated our chat today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Absolute pleasure.
And thank you for tuning into Conversations for Health. Check out the show notes for resources from today's episode, including the clinical research. Please share this podcast with your colleagues, follow, rate, or leave a review wherever you listen or watch. And thank you for designing a well world with us.
This is Conversations for Health with Evelyn Lambrecht, dedicated to engaging discussions with industry experts, exploring evidence-based, cutting-edge research, and practical tips.